not the world outside, that kept going with its sounds and steps and side conversations, but my world. It stopped and turned entirely toward that voice. It took me a few seconds to muster the courage to look. My heart, curiously, didn't beat faster. It beat deeper, as if recognizing without a shadow of doubt the presence of something that had never truly left. When I finally raised my eyes, there he was, a little more stooped, his hair now more silver than brown, his skin marked by the years, but the same eyes, the same way of standing in silence while choosing fruit. I didn't know what to do with my hands, or my feet, and then, as if life conspired to make it all happen in the simplest, and therefore most unforgettable Zbeki way, he turned, saw me, and froze. For a second there was no time, no past or present, just that look. He let the apple slip from his hand and, without saying anything, just walked toward me, with slow but determined steps. He stopped a few inches away. His teary eyes said what neither of us dared to say yet. "Amara?" he said, as if testing if I was real. I just nodded, feeling the tears I'd held back for years finally take shape. "You're still here." I said I would be. That was it. 2 sentences. So small, so immense. He touched my face like someone afraid of waking from a dream. I smiled, my hands trembling, and his touch felt the same, even though his hands were different, more aged, less steady. But the gesture was his, the care, the lightness. We stood there in the middle of the market, surrounded by people who had no idea what that moment meant. And maybe that was for the best, because what passed between us couldn't fit in anyone's gaze. It was too big. It was made of everything we didn't say, everything we didn't live, and yet everything that still seemed possible. Hours later, I could still feel his fingers on mine. We walked side by side from the market to an old cafe in town. The same one we used to go to on Sunday afternoons, when the world was small enough to fit between a glance and a restrained laugh. We chose the corner table, as if instinctively, knowing we'd need a place where silence was allowed. We sat, and for a while we just stayed there, watching the steam rise from our cups, as if afraid any word might say too much. But he spoke first. "There hasn't been a day I didn't think of you." And it wasn't exaggeration. There was no dramatic flourish in his eyes, just a deep, raw honesty, like someone who'd spent years conversing with their own memory. "Didn't know if you'd still be here," he continued, his voice lower. "But I hoped you would be, even when it seemed absurd, even when everything said otherwise." Hearing that pierced me with an almost painful gentleness. Not because I doubted, but because for so many years I waited in silence, unsure if there was another side to this invisible thread. "I stayed," I replied, "not because I didn't have opportunities, but because none of them were you." He smiled, and in that smile was sadness and gratitude, as if he understood, without needing to explain, the cost of loving someone from afar and still choosing to love. We talked for hours, about what happened after he left, about the time that carried him down other paths, about the letters he wrote and never sent. He had lost his mother, lived abroad, and came so close, so very close, to erasing the name that still lived in the most untouched part of his soul, mine. And I told him about my life, about my students, the garden, the solitary birthdays, the parties I never liked, and the promise I never broke. We didn't speak of guilt. We didn't speak of regret. We spoke only of what survived. He held my hand across the table as if we were still in our early 20s. But there was something different. There was firmness, yes, but also humility. The humility of two hearts that, even separated by decades, still had room for each other. "Do you think there's still time?" he asked, looking into me. And I, with teary eyes and a chest calmer than ever before, answered in a whisper, "For the right love." There always is. In the days that followed, I learned to relearn. To live with a love that returned, but not as it was before. He was no longer that young man with straight shoulders and urgent dreams, just as I was no longer the girl with restrained silences and hopeful eyes. Now we were two bodies, marked by time, but still able to recognize, with a single glance, everything that was never said. And so, with slow steps and respect for all we hadn't lived, we began again. We didn't talk about making up for lost time, because we knew time can't be recovered. It can only be accepted. And accepting isn't giving up, it's loving with clarity. Jonathan started visiting almost every day. He brought flowers from the market, fresh bread, and sometimes just his company, as if that were enough. And it was. We walked together to the church where my parents were married, sat on the bench in the central square with ice cream in our hands, and I noticed something new. Love, when it matures, doesn't need to be grand. It just needs to be present. He is Jew. Listened to my stories as if hearing them for the first time, even when I repeated myself, and I learned things about him I might not have known before. His fear of no longer being worthy, his insecurity about returning after so long, his surprise at discovering that my affection hadn't just survived. It had grown. There was one afternoon in particular, one of those when the sky seems to know life is quietly reorganizing itself. We were on my porch, our legs covered with a blanket, the sun hiding behind the trees. He looked at me with a smile that mixed gratitude and amazement. "You haven't changed, Amara." I smiled back, not correcting him, because he was right, in a way. What was most essential in me, that silent loyalty, that faith I chose to keep without fanfare, was still there. I wasn't the same, but the woman he loved had never ceased to exist. She was just waiting for the right moment to resurface. We didn't talk about the future out loud, but he started leaving books on my shelf. He began bringing his coat and forgetting it on purpose. He started asking what I thought about setting the breakfast table for two, even when he hadn't arrived yet. And in those small actions, I understood we were already living what we hadn't lived before, without haste, without fear, without needing to prove anything to the world, just to ourselves. Life with him began to take shape without needing to name it. It was like we were embroidering a quilt together, one stitch a day, in no hurry to finish. Jonathan started staying over on weekends. He brought his medications in a small blue toiletry bag, which he left by my wardrobe as if that corner had always been his. I learned to make his coffee the way he liked, strong, no sugar with a pinch of cinnamon. And he started tending to my plants with an almost ceremonial care, as if each flower said, "Here, someone waits for you every day." Sometimes silence was enough for us. We sat on the couch, hands intertwined like two roots that after so long, in the dark, finally found solid ground to grow. He told me about the world he'd seen, and how, even from afar, everything reminded him of me. A bridge in Lisbon, a market in Marrakesh, a perfume that made him stop, close his eyes, and remember my skin on summer mornings. I listened with an open heart. There was no jealousy for the time he lived away. There was, in fact, a quiet pride in knowing that in all his journeys there was a space reserved for me. And I, who for so long thought I waited alone, now understood. He had kept me too, in his way, in his time, but he kept me. We started creating small traditions. Afternoon tea on Saturdays with butter cookies, hand-in-hand walks down the main street, reading nights out loud when he insisted on dramatizing characters just to make me laugh, We laughed a lot, more than I could have imagined. We laughed even at our wrinkles, our aching knees, our memories that sometimes got jumbled, because the joy didn't come from novelty, but from companionship. And in every gesture, every shared breath, every wordless glance, we knew. We were, at last, living what we had waited so long for. It wasn't a young love. It was a mature, clean, unpretentious love. A love that didn't need to prove it existed, because it was felt even in silence. And I felt whole. Not like someone rescued, but like someone found. Not like someone who waited to be saved, but someone who waited because she knew that loving truly is also knowing how to stay. Time, that silent old craftsman, began to move more slowly for us. Mornings took on more meaning than entire days. It was in opening the curtains, in the coffee served with still sleepy hands, in the sound of birds outside, and in the simple fact of waking up and knowing he was there. Jonathan no longer made grand plans. Neither did I. We didn't need to. We were in the time that matters, the now. And the now, when lived with someone you love deeply, has a flavor even youth doesn't know. The flavor of calm, of security, of absolute presence. One day, he took me to the bench where we said goodbye for the last time before he left. We sat, in the same spot, like two ghosts reconciling with memory. "This is where I promised I'd come back," he said, "and where I decided that if I ever had the chance, I'd do everything differently." I looked at him, no longer with the urgency to ask, why did it take so long? Because the answer was there, in our intertwined hands and mirrored wrinkles. Life is like that. Sometimes it interrupts, sometimes it detours, but when it's meant to be, it returns, and it returns stronger. They say waiting is an act of faith, but they never say that faith can hurt too. They never say that, after a while, waiting stops being a romantic gesture and becomes a way of existing. And that's exactly how I lived the last 40 years, not as someone counting the days, but as someone who turned each one into a small candle lit within my chest. My name is Amara Lisandre. I was raised in a white mansion in a small town where everyone knows each other's stories before they're even told. The only child of a stern father and a mother too sweet for this world, I learned early to keep what I felt tucked between my heart and throat. The first time I fell in love was at 21, and it wasn't just any love. It was the kind that can't be explained, the kind that doesn't ask for permission. He came in a spring when I was starting to believe life would just be a sequence of obligations, afternoon teas, and letters from suitors who said pretty things without soul. But he was different. He had a way of listening that created silence within. He had calm hands, deep eyes, and that restrained urgency of someone carrying the world, but would stop it all for you. And he did, for a while. He was mine for a few seasons. He showed me that love doesn't need to shout to be eternal. Sometimes, it's enough that it exists fully for a few moments. But the world called him back. A greater obligation, a hard choice. And he went. With a kiss on my forehead, a plea to wait, and a promise that he'd return as soon as he could. I didn't cry. I just said I'd wait. As if it was simple. As if I knew how many empty mornings fit inside a promise made with teary eyes. I was never certain he'd come back. But I also could never, not for a second, imagine that the love we felt was meant to end. I didn't accept invitations to go, out with others, even when they came with flowers, with patience, with all the things said to be ideal for healing an absence. I didn't accept because it wasn't absence that lived in me. It was too much presence. He was in everything. The sound of leaves in the wind, the smell of wet earth, the music I played softly just to remember how he closed his eyes when he listened. Over time, the memory stopped hurting and became part of me, like a feature of my own face. I kept living. aging with dignity, caring for the house, my parents' memory, the garden flowers. But the love I held never stayed in the past. It just fell silent, waiting, perhaps, for the right time to breathe again. They say time heals everything, but whoever says that has never lived with an absence that doesn't hurt enough to be called a wound, nor light enough to be forgotten. His absence was more like a shadow, silent, ever present, and sometimes even comforting. I graduated in literature and taught for many years at the local public school. People said I was too kind, too dedicated, and sometimes looked at me with a kind of pity that, though silent, I could feel in the air. I never saw it as loneliness, not the kind that devours, at least. I had friends, colleagues, students who became like daughters, neighbors who visited with cakes and everyday stories. But there was a room inside me that always remained locked, a place just mine, a place where that farewell morning still lived, that hurriedly written letter, his scent on my scarf, which I never washed again. The years drew lines on my face, but I accepted them with the same calm I accepted the passing seasons. Each line reminded me of all I'd lived and all I'd waited for. I never told anyone about him, at least not in full detail. Not out of fear, but because some stories are too big to be reduced to words. I dreamed of him sometimes, and they weren't happy-ending dreams. They were just brief, silent encounters, as if my soul only wanted to see him sitting across from me again, even if without touch, without words, without time. Sometimes I woke with a heart full of tenderness, other times with an ache that lingered all day. But even so, I never regretted it, because loving someone like that, even if for a short time, is already in itself a miracle. There were days when I almost forgot his face, and it was on those days that the longing hit hardest, as if saying, "Don't forget him, not yet." So I'd take the only photograph we had together, taken by chance at a summer picnic, with him smiling, his head resting on my shoulder. And I'd look at it for too long, not to suffer, but to remember that it happened, that it was real, and that, in some way only my heart understood, it still was. Even when everyone around me had stopped asking, even when the world moved on and I did too, but with a part of me always returning to that summer, that look, that promise, whispered before he disappeared behind the wooden door that never opened again. Life has a strange way of going on even when the heart lingers at some point in the past. I became a woman of habits, not out of rigidity but for protection. I woke up at the same time every day, made my chamomile tea with exactly 1 spoonful of honey, read the morning papers, and tended to the garden with the same devotion an artist gives to their most intimate work. My former students still sent me letters, and every now and then someone knocked on my door just to say they remembered me as a strong, wise, serene woman, and I smiled, because serene I was. But strong? I learned that strength doesn't always come from battles won. Sometimes it comes from the silence of those who keep going, even without any guarantee they're on the right path. It was on one of those rust-colored late afternoons that the question came for the first time. Not as a blow, but as a cold breeze slipping through a forgotten open window. What if he doesn't come back? I was sitting on the porch, as always, watching the sky change color. The swallows returned to their branches, and the world seemed so full of small, completed cycles, of returns. And there I was, the only one still waiting for something that showed no sign of returning. My fingers, now marked by time, held the cup firmly, but my chest trembled. It was a thought I'd avoided for decades, because even doubting takes strength. Even doubting is dangerous when all you have is a guarded hope. But I didn't cry. Not that day, nor the ones that followed, because something in me, something no time could erode. Still pulsed with the same softness with which he said my name. I allowed myself to face the possibility of eternal absence, but I didn't let it destroy me. If he never came back, what we lived would still have been true. If he never crossed my gate again, I would still have been loved with the depth of someone who carries another forever. The truth is, some weights aren't a burden, they're a home. And in that home, made of memory, silence, and faith, I continued. Because even without knowing if he'd ever return, I knew he'd taken me with him. It was a morning that began like any other, with the smell of bread from the bakery next door wafting through the window, the distant sound of the local church bells, and the clink of the spoon in my teacup. I was reading the town newspaper, as I had for years, more out of habit than interest. The headlines were always similar: local politics, birthdays of old residents, Sunday events. But that morning, among forgettable columns and black and white photos, a name appeared before me like a stone thrown into a sleeping lake, a name I hadn't heard in over 30 years, a name not tied to me by blood or contract, but still, the invisible thread connecting all my days. It was a small note, a forgotten social column in the bottom corner of the page, announcing that Jonathan Hall has returned to the town after years living abroad and will be one of the guests of honor at the opening of the new Veterans Center. Jonathan Hall, 3 words, but enough to make my entire body forget how to breathe. There were many Jonathans in the world, many Halls, but something inside me knew, with the silent certainty that comes only once in a lifetime, that it was him. My heart didn't race, as it does in stories. It stilled, as if saying, I knew. I stared at that piece of paper as if it were a portal. My mind began filling in the blanks. How was he now? Would there be wrinkles around his eyes like mine? Would he still remember the color of my voice? Had he kept the scarf I left folded inside the book I lent him the day before he left? I wanted to run out, knock on every door, shout to the world that he was back. But instead, I just closed the newspaper slowly and let my hand rest on it. Because some news, when it arrives, demands silence to take root. In the days that followed, everything around me stayed the same. But inside, something was starting to reorganize. I noticed it in small things, the way I combed my hair with more care, the attention I gave to the dress I chose, the way my eyes scanned the street with discreet expectation. It wasn't euphoria, it wasn't illusion. It was as if life had, without warning, pressed the resume button, and I, even without knowing how to act, let the movement begin. Because hope, the real kind, doesn't vanish. It just falls silent, waiting for the moment when someone on the other side of time says, now. The reunion wasn't like I dreamed. There was no music in the background, no breeze touching my face, no commotion that swept me off my feet. It was a simple, almost accidental gesture, but absolutely definitive. I was at the town market, looking at apples as I did every Saturday, when I heard a voice I hadn't heard in over 3 decades. It didn't call me. It didn't say my name. It just asked the vendor if those were from the new harvest, with that drawl he had when distracted. And in that instant, the world stopped. Our bodies no longer had the same rhythm. Sometimes one of us forgot words mid-sentence. Sometimes we needed to lean on each other to climb a step. But all of that was part of it. It wasn't sacrifice. It was love in its calmest form. The kind that offers itself with kindness, without demands, without expecting perfection. The love between us no longer shouted. It simply endured, like late afternoon light streaming through the windows. One Sunday, while we set the breakfast table, he stopped in the middle of the kitchen and looked at me as if he wanted to keep that moment forever. If you knew how much I thought of this moment, he whispered. I smiled. I thought of it too. And it was there, amid warm bread and tea spilled on the tablecloth, that I understood. The waiting was over. But its beauty wasn't in the reunion. It was in everything it taught us to be until that reunion was possible. Today, I no longer count the days. I'm in no hurry. The love I waited for didn't come like a storm. It came like a breeze. And it stayed, because true love doesn't need to arrive early. It just needs to arrive and choose to stay. It's not about happy endings. It's about true endings. About eyes that meet after decades and still recognize each other. About hands that touch without haste, because they've already learned the value of staying. Waiting, for Jonathan, wasn't a sacrifice. It was the most silent and whole way of loving I've ever known. Today, if someone asks me if it was worth it, I don't answer with words. I just look at him, sitting in the living room armchair, reading one of our favorite books for the 1000th time, and smile. Because love isn't measured by how long it took to happen. Love is measured by everything that survived within us until it did.